Welcome to the Hyperion Hub, your meeting place for all things Disney. And now your hosts.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the Hyperion Hub. I'm John Alois, and joined by Sean Degenhart.
Hi there.
And John Redling Schaefer.
Hey guys.
I'm so excited we're talking about comic books this week. Let's start it off with our Disney views. And recently, my family and I had the opportunity to head up to the Museum of Science and Industry and see Marvel Universe of Superheroes. Have you guys been able to go see this exhibit yet?
I haven't. I didn't even realize it was there until I saw your pictures on Facebook. It looks amazing.
It is amazing. That's a great way to put it. Go ahead, John.
I think there's so much to do at that museum in Chicago anyway. To add an extra element of fun for a Disney fan is something that's unique and everybody should take advantage of. I wish we could, but spring and summer is going to be here before we know it. Well, how long does it go for?
It is there until October 24th. Unfortunately, though, tickets are sold out till at least May, so they're going quickly, so you better pick them up. You have to reserve your entry time to get into the museum, and then you also have an entry time to get into Marvel Universe of Superheroes. They have artifacts, they have old comic books, they have Marvel Comics #1. You can stand right next to it, be in the same air as it. They have Spider-Man #1. They have costumes from the films, and not just the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but all the Marvel films and the Netflix TV shows. They have props. We got to see Thor's hammer and Cap's shield.
Was the Batmobile there?
Oh, man. You know, April 1st was a few weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
I might end this call now.
Even the non-Marvel guy's smart enough to keep his mouth shut for this.
No, it is awesome. It's something to see. They have a really cool area where you can kind of virtually become Iron Man and fly around his lab. They've got an old memorabilia area from toys and Halloween costumes from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Viewmaster reels, all really, really cool stuff. It is not included in the price of the museum. It's $18 for adults plus museum entry, and children ages 3 to 11, it's $14 plus museum entry.
That's not bad at all.
Yeah, not at all. Check it out. Oh, and you guys understand, you know the Disney connection with the Museum of Science and Industry, I believe, don't you?
I don't think I do.
Okay. So it was built for the 1893 World's Fair, and who knows, Elias Disney may have worked on it. He came to Chicago to work on the fair. It was actually the Palace of the Fine Arts and was reused in the 1933 World's Fair, renovated and rebuilt kind of on the inside. And now today it's the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. This week, we are digging deep into Marvel history, and it's Marvel 101, Part 1. Now, before we start, we've got a lot to cover, so I want to know what you guys grew up with. I mean, what are your memories of Marvel?
John, I'm going to be honest. This is pretty much an introductory class for a guy who didn't grow up with Marvel. For whatever reason, sure, Disney was a big part of my life, but comic books, superheroes, sure. Some of the biggies, right? Everybody had certain memorabilia. But this is 101 for this guy right here.
For me, apart from, the occasional Spider-Man cartoons, I was more of a DC guy, not comic books, but would not miss the Super Friends. And there may be a picture of me somewhere in my Batman underoos when I was about 8 years old. But other than that,
we'll post that on we'll post that on our social media, right? Yes.
But more of a DC guy growing up than Marvel.
Well, I was too. DC kind of ruled the roost. They had the best TV shows. They had the best live action movies when I was growing up. And I too woke up at 7 a.m. on Saturday mornings to watch Super Friends and then Superpowers in the 1980s. I was a big DC fan. I knew Spider-Man, but and Incredible Hulk. but really wasn't a big Marvel guy. And then the movies kind of changed everything for me. And then once Disney bought Marvel, everything changed for me. So we're going to take a look at the history of Marvel. On August 31st, 2009, after weeks of internal scrutiny, a story years in the making, Disney announced they just paid $4 billion to acquire Marvel Entertainment. Investors didn't think it was a great idea at the time, and Disney stock dropped 3% that day. A decade later, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is the highest-grossing film franchise in history. Where did it all begin? We have to go back over 80 years to a time of pulp magazines. In 1939, Mark Goodman published paperback books, men's adventure magazines, and comic books under the name Timely Publications, based out of Manhattan. Fantasy stories were in high demand for an American public still struggling through the Great Depression. The first issue, titled Marvel Comics No. 1, was released in October and featured android hero the Human Torch and the Angel from creators Carl Burgos and Paul Gustafson. This was a different Human Torch, by the way, than the one found in today's Fantastic Four. One character from that issue that is still in use today was Bel Everett's anti-hero, Submariner. Through the years, Marvel has showcased strong convictions and beliefs. With the popularity of superheroes on the rise in the late 1930s and early 1940s, inspired by what was happening abroad, legendary creators Joe Simon and Disney legend Jack Kirby launched Captain America. In what some would consider a controversial move, Cap was seen punching out Adolf Hitler on the cover of the first issue, almost a year before the U.S. entered World War II. In a 2017 Washington Post article, Marvel editor Tom Brevoort said, "Putting Adolf Hitler, a still living world leader, on the cover of a comic book as a villain was definitely a daring and even dangerous move. Apart from supporters of the Axis cause, there was a strong isolationist feeling in America." I thought that was fascinating, by the way, when I first read that. I never even thought of that.
Right. And so that was a year before the U.S. entered? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's daring. I mean, when you think about it, because you're right, that comment about the isolationism, we weren't doing anything until Pearl Harbor. You know, that's interesting.
Cap made his film debut in 1944. Republic Pictures released a 15-chapter serial. It's loosely based on the comic book superhero, but it does don the famous costume. In 1939, Goodman hired his wife's cousin, 17-year-old Stanley Lieber, as an office assistant. 2 years later, his managing editor, Joe Simon, quit, and the apprentice became the new man in charge. Eventually, he would change his name, and today we all know him as Stan Lee, who is also a Disney legend. He had aspirations to one day write the great American novel, so he used Stan Lee while he was at Marvel. In the meantime, he stuck with comics, which found new genres besides superheroes. Mysteries and comedies also dominated the newsstands. After the war, popularity of superheroes waned. Just like that, they disappeared off stands. Gone were characters like the Wizard, Jack Frost, the Defender, and Captain America and his sidekick Bucky. One reason they fell out of favor was many of their readers were young armed forces men. When they came home, they found they no longer had time for comics, as they were finding careers and starting families. Young boys kept cartoon comics popular, and many young girls started reading comics. Millie the Model and Patsy Walker were in print for nearly 2 decades. There was also Nellie the Nurse and Tessie the Typist. By the start of the 1950s, the so-called golden age of comics had ended, and the company changed its name to Atlas Comics, after owner Goodman launched his own distribution network under the same name. Paper rationing was over, so the newsstands filled with all sorts of pulp magazines and comics, and the market was flooded. There was relatively new competition as well as television grew in popularity. Romance stories, westerns, sports, and horror and strange mysteries dominated the 1950s. Everything changed in 1954 When Frederick Wertham released his best-selling book, The Seduction of the Innocent, which warned parents that comic books was a contributor to juvenile delinquency. While crime comics were listed as the leading factor, superhero and horror comics were mentioned as well. Organized protests and boycotts of outlets selling comics became routine, as did mass comic book burnings. This book directly led to the Comics Code Authority, which screened comics. The seal provided assurance to parents, but the book almost took down the industry completely. The Atlas name kind of just faded away. As titles dwindled, Lee formed a much tighter team of artists that included Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, who began to experiment. As we close out the decade, the basically nameless company turns a profit as a bottom feeder, but they begin to push their creative to new heights. Superheroes were again making a comeback, and as the story goes, Goodman was playing golf with an unnamed executive who mentioned that superheroes were selling well for DC Comics, especially a comic that starred the Justice League. So Goodman immediately told editor Stan Lee to produce a team of superheroes for their company. Goodman probably expected Lee to follow DC's lead, but according to Lee, he told his wife he didn't want to just follow suit, and he was ready to quit and move on to writing that great American novel. So his wife supposedly said, "Since you're going to quit anyway, why don't you write a book you want to write?" In late 1961, he created the team known as the First Family of Marvel. Up till this point, superheroes were pretty much perfect, with closely guarded secret identities and a significant other who was in love with their alter egos. Lee and Kirby broke that mold. They wanted their heroes to be real people with real problems who argued with each other and didn't bother having secret identities. This was a book for an older audience. Desperate to beat the Russians into space, scientist Reed Richards built his own spacecraft. Unfortunately, Richards' proper shielding and cosmic rays transformed him and his crew into the Fantastic Four. The book was an unexpected success, so Lee did not quit. Fan mail began rolling in, and the Marvel Age was off and running.
So I love how the track continues. You know, we're talking about pre-World War II, and now even the creation of this completely new chapter still evokes world politics. You know, the Soviets and the space war. I think that's neat.
Well, and one thing that I was unaware of until I got into the MCU, you know, watching the first Avengers movie, I'm like, wait, these guys aren't friends. They're not all one big happy team fighting crime, you know, so I was surprised at that angle just because that's what I had grown up with, you know, with DC.
Yeah, you know, these guys were based out of New York, and New York has a tough exterior, and, you know, family just kind of talks to each other that way there. And, yeah, they don't all get along, but they come together to get the job done. The next big hit came in March 1962 when Lee and Kirby wanted a Jekyll and Hyde monster as a hero. Dr. Bruce Banner, experimenting with a new G-bomb, was exposed to a full force of gamma radiation while trying to save a teenage boy from a test site. That explosion and exposure created the Incredible Hulk. In August of '62, teenager Peter Parker was bitten by a radioactive spider. Stan Lee's thought was that every teen is always the sidekick. Let's make him the hero with superhuman strength and the ability to crawl up walls. He's quick-witted and loved by his fans, but adults don't trust him, and when he's out of the suit, he doesn't have many friends and struggles to help his Aunt May pay the rent. The best lesson he learned, advice he lives by today, he had to learn the hard way. After Peter gained his powers, he used them to make money. Following a robbery, he was put in position to stop the robber. He refused to help. That robber eventually ended up killing his Uncle Ben. The lesson he learned: with great power comes great responsibility. The Amazing Spider-Man made his debut in Amazing Fantasy number 15. Journey into Mystery number 83 brought about the Norse god, the mighty Thor. Tales to Astonish number 35 saw the return of a character who shrunk himself. Hank Pym made his debut in issue number 27, but the superhero known as Ant-Man was here to stay in 35.
I want to interject here, John, because you're listing new creation. How did they intertwine? Did they intertwine? You're mentioning certain editions of comic books. How are they introduced through the existing characters or just miraculously appearing?
So by this point, they had a series of comics that didn't really showcase one person or one story, comic after comic. That's why we see Spider-Man show up in Amazing Fantasy number 15, and some of these other books. Thor came out of Journey into Mystery number 83. So they were just kind of trying to see what was successful, what would be successful. And as sales grew for those books, eventually those books would get their own isolated titles. At this point, though, nobody's interacting with each other.
Okay.
Not much, anyway. The Marvel bullpen continued to experiment. In March 1963, in Tales of Suspense number 39, millionaire industrialist Tony Stark, who designed weapons for the United States Army, was captured by communists. With the help of another prisoner who later sacrificed himself to save him, Stark designed his life-saving Iron Man armor. He also carried a terrible secret. The accident that led to his becoming Iron Man also injured his heart. He needed his armor chest plate to stay alive. Stan's brother Larry Lieber wrote the origin story, and artist Don Heck designed the character's early look. Other legendary characters, heroes, and villains followed, and demand was growing for team-up books. Here we go. With an increasingly busy Stan providing an outline and Jack drawing and filling in the rest of the storylines, Marvel's real answer to the Justice League came in 1963 in September. Thor's brother Loki caused the Hulk to go on a rampage. Answering the call were Thor, Iron Man, Ant-Man, and the Wasp. They, along with Hulk, turned to take on Loki and form the Avengers. So if you're a comic book fan in 1963 and you're reading all these one-offs, how exciting is it to pay one price to see all these heroes in one book?
Right. I mean, that's what, again, maybe my question was a little too early. I mean, there's a lot coming at you as a kid, and it's interesting you mentioned that the demand grew for them to team up. It was only a matter of time, but it's funny that they finally did come full circle to what maybe Stan Lee didn't want to do at the beginning. It's very interesting. And
it's also interesting that there were a lot of superheroes that weren't popular, so they kind of just fell by the wayside. So these guys, as their sales grew, they understood what an all-star team they could have and put them together. Eventually, they were joined by that World War II hero, Captain America, whom they discovered frozen and was stuck in the ice from the 1940s until they found him in the 1960s. Next, Lee and Kirby tackled a prejudice in a form of superheroes. Up till now, heroes acquired their powers. What if they were born with them and they mutated over time? And what if humanity feared and hated all mutants? Think of the rich stories. Well, the X-Men debuted the same month as the Avengers, and Marvel could do no wrong at this point. Making their debuts in the decade were Daredevil, the Scarlet Witch and her brother Quicksilver, Hawkeye, Dr. Octopus, Electro, the Black Widow, the Green Goblin, Doctor Strange, Medusa and the Inhumans, Mary Jane Watson, Gwen Stacy, Nick Fury, S.H.I.E.L.D., Galactus, the Silver Surfer, the Kingpin, the Vulture, Ultron, Vision, the original Captain Marvel, and in July of 1966, Marvel once again changed the landscape, making his debut in Fantastic Four number 52. T'Challa, the King of Wakanda, took on the Fantastic Four to test himself. The Black Panther was up for the challenge. He wasn't the first black superhero, but he was the first widely known. All those characters that I mentioned are still in use today. I mean, that's one 10-year period. That's pretty spectacular. By this point in the mid-60s, Marvel was in the mainstream, licensing its characters for plastic hobby kits, hats, Halloween costumes, trading cards, and board games. In September, fans were treated to the first animated TV show featuring their favorite characters. If you guys haven't seen these, you need to look them up on YouTube. They're not stellar, but they're fun to watch. The Marvel superheroes featured Cap, Hulk, Iron Man, Thor, and Submariner. The animation was subpar compared to what we're used to. The limited animation was produced by Xerography, consisting of photocopied images taken from the comics, and they barely had any animation to them.
And for a pre-Disney buyout, that's how 101 Dalmatians was done. I think that was one of the early films to use that.
Yeah. Much higher quality, though.
Yeah.
Bigger budgets. The Fantastic Four in 1967 was also higher quality animation. Spider-Man also started in 1967 with its catchy theme song, and it ran for decades in syndication. On to the 1970s, and new writers like Chris Claremont and Don McGregor pushed Marvel to new heights. The company also made licensing deals that brought Conan the Barbarian and George Lucas's Star Wars into the fold. Jack Kirby left Marvel in 1970, marking the end of an incredibly creative era. Kirby would eventually return later in the decade. In 1971, the U.S. government Department of Health, Education, and Welfare asked editor Stan Lee to use his comics to warn his young audience about the rising use of dangerous, addictive drugs. Problem was that Comics Code Authority from the 50s didn't allow the mention of drugs for any purpose. So Stan ran a 3-part series in Spider-Man without the code seal of approval. In the story, Peter's best friend, Harry Osborn, becomes addicted to pills and had to be hospitalized. The story changed the code and gave American comics greater creative freedom. Marvel saw its first live-action character on The Electric Company in 1974 in Spidey Super Stories. Did you guys watch this show as a kid? John, you were born in like the late 90s, but the show...
My knees would disagree with you, but yes, all right.
The show was, it was part of a PBS series of kid shows, and Spidey was on there. It was pretty neat to see him before we ever saw him in live action. During the mid-70s, Stan Lee, now the Marvel Comics publisher, sold CBS the rights to produce a primetime live-action Spider-Man show. Nicholas Hammond was cast as the lead. A 90-minute film and 12 episodes followed before getting canceled. It's pretty rough to watch these days, unlike The Incredible Hulk starring Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno. This show lasted 5 seasons and was the most successful Marvel show for decades. One property that didn't catch on in its 70s made-for-TV films was Captain America. You guys need to look that one up as well. Plastic shield, he rode around on a little motorcycle. Yeah. Characters making their decade debuts included Ghost Rider, Shang-Chi, Howard the Duck, Guardians of the Galaxy, The Eternals, Falcon, Carol Danvers as Ms. Marvel, and Spider-Woman. In 1974, the John Romita-designed Claude Canadian Mutant, Wolverine, first appeared in The Incredible Hulk, number 181.
I'm going to interject, John. Howard the Duck? I had no idea there was Howard the Duck.
He plays a big role in the 1980s, and we'll get to him in the next episode. Throughout the 80s and 90s, we'll see an influx of Marvel cartoon shows. Spider-Man, Spider-Woman, The Fantastic Four, X-Men, and several others fill the kids' airwaves. However, Marvel couldn't quite crack the box office market. In the next installment of Marvel 101, Marvel has a tough time and begins signing away licensing rights to stay in business. Then the combination of Disney and the MCU find that perfect moment to create movie magic. Well, we hope you enjoyed that. We have more coming up in the next episode. Until then, if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, please go rate and review us so more people find the show. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter. We're at Hub Hyperion. You can email us at podcast@thehyperionhub.com. That's all from here, everyone. Have a marvelous week.
Find us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The Hyperion Hub is not affiliated with the Walt Disney Company or its subsidiaries. We'll meet you next time at the Hyperion Hub.
That's all from here, everyone. Have a marvelous week.
Oh, I see what you did there.
Ooh, clever.
It just came to me.